The NFL, arguably the biggest sports league in American history. When the public thinks of the NFL, they think of the big hits, the halftime shows, maybe even players like Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, Myles Garrett, Tyreek Hill, and Lamar Jackson. But how did we get here? Who pioneered pro football to what is today? Let's rewind all the way back to the 1920s. For every decade, I'm going to be showing you notable events that happened during the time, notable names, and how the game looked like on the left. A bunch of football-minded men got together and decided to start the APFA, which would later on have its name changed to the NFL. Jim Thorpe, a multi-sport athlete and Olympic gold medalist, was named president of the APFA for his knowledge and his overall popularity. During that first season, the Akron Pros were the first champions. One player stood out of all of them. That player was Fritz Pollard. Fritz was a big part of the NFL breaking its color barrier. The biggest event during this period, which I also found out to be the first major NFL scandal, was the 1925 NFL Championship. The Chicago Cardinals were awarded the 1925 championship, but the Pottsville Maroons had a better record and had beaten those Cardinals earlier in the season. But the Maroons had broken a major rule which disqualified them from winning the championship. The Maroons found this very unfair and were very angry about it, and decided just to call themselves champions and make their own trophy. The NFL during the 1930s had a lot of up and downs. One of the major downs was the Great Depression, which had put them in a very, very bad state. So bad that they only had 8 teams in the NFL during that time, which is the lowest in NFL history. But a lot of very important things happened during this time. The first important thing was the NFL championship game. The NFL granted teams as champions by their record and not by a game. And this brought in the first ever championship game to be played. 3 years later, the NFL would have its first ever NFL draft. And then another 3 years later, the NFL would have its first ever televised game, which is probably the biggest thing that has happened during this decade, which would bring the NFL's popularity skyrocketing to the roof. During the 1940s and 50s, not much really happened, but there are 2 very important things that happened. One of those was World War II. It had affected multiple teams with shortage of players, especially with Pittsburgh. Both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia were short on teams, and they had to merge together to have the nickname the Steagles. The Eagles would later on get some of their players back and would end up becoming independent again. But then Pittsburgh needed to find a new team to merge to, so they went to Chicago with the Cardinals. And they had a very boring name in Card Pit, compared to that really cool Steagles name. Arguably the biggest game changer in NFL history, Paul Brown. Paul Brown revolutionized many things in the NFL, but most importantly what he did to the helmet. He made 2 major changes, one of them being the bar around the front of the helmet. He famously added the bar, or also known as the face mask, to prevent face injuries, and a radio on the ear so players wouldn't have to call plays through hand signals. The 60s was probably the biggest turning point in NFL history, especially with new competition in town with the AFL. The American Football League was started by a bunch of wealthy football-minded men that wanted to start their own NFL franchise but was denied. Their main goal was to compete with the NFL. The Golden Boy himself, Paul Hornung, was caught gambling on his own games, which was a very huge scandal at the time, and I thought it was worth mentioning, I don't know. The best player during the 60s, Jim Brown, was completely unstoppable. He was the face of the NFL and wanted to make an impact, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. He teamed up with other big athletes like Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, and a very young Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to fight for racial equality and to support Ali's decision to resist his draft status. Jim Brown would retire early and become a very successful actor. The tension between the AFL and the NFL has been rising every single year. So both leagues decided to have their 2 best teams play against each other in what would be later known to be called the Super Bowl. The NFL's Green Bay Packers had won the first 2 Super Bowls, but for the third one, it was the Colts versus the Jets. The Colts were heavy favorites for this game, but the New York Jets had AFL star Joe Namath. Since playing college ball at Alabama, Joe Namath has been one of the biggest personalities in football. He famously guaranteed that his Jets will win against the heavy favorite Colts, and that's exactly what happened. The Jets would be the first ever AFL team to be Super Bowl champions. This was very impactful at the time because the AFL was seen as a little brother, but ever since the Jets won, the AFL was seen as a league to be reckoned with. During the 1970s, the NFL had the introduction of Monday Night Football, the Immaculate Reception, but most importantly, the AFL-NFL merger. Both leagues were expected to merge at some point, and the NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle made it possible. In 1972, the Miami Dolphins would become the first and only undefeated team during the Super Bowl era. Their undefeated record has still not been broken to this day. The 80s was mainly bloomed by the San Francisco 49ers and the 85 Bears, but the biggest storyline during this decade was the USFL. The USFL was a new football league trying to compete with the NFL. It started slow, but they started to grow with adding players like Hall of Famer Jim Kelly, Heisman winner Doug Flutie, but most importantly running back Herschel Walker. But the league started to die down quickly, and for a last-second effort, they tried suing the NFL. But the USFL won a laughable $3. I would like to mention Doug Williams. He became the first black quarterback to start and win a Super Bowl. This was very impactful at the time because the quarterback position was seen as a white man's position. The 90s was very impactful for the entertainment part of the NFL. As you can see in the notable names, we have Michael Jackson. It's funny to say Michael Jackson is one of the NFL's biggest game changers because of his electric Super Bowl halftime show. He brought more attention to the game and made the halftime show a big part on why the Super Bowl gets the views it has today. Now we're going to switch to MJ to OJ. OJ Simpson is an NFL Hall of Famer and a big personality on TV. He famously killed his ex-wife and her friend. He would later on go on trial and notoriously be found not guilty. This event always gave the NFL a bad rep on their players. Hitting the new century, we were introduced to Tom Brady and his success, but the NFL in the 2000s became the most controversial decade for league history. Before we get into the controversies, we had the XFL in the early 2000s. The XFL was another startup football league that wanted to compete with the NFL. To keep it short, it was terrible. The XFL would go down as one of the worst startup football leagues in history. Dr. Bennett Malu was a Nigerian surgeon who had discovered CTE in an NFL player's brain. That player was Hall of Famer Mike Webster. Amalu went to the NFL to work things out, but they completely rejected him for advice. The story brought the awareness of serious head injuries to NFL players, and it would be proven more with the actions of players like Junior Seau, who took his life because he kept complaining that his head was hurting, Jovan Belcher, who killed his partner and then later himself in front of his coaches, and Aaron Hernandez, who killed multiple people and also ended up taking his life. Amalu's discovery was so huge that the NFL safety rules have completely changed, and they even made a movie starring Will Smith as Amalu. Ricky Williams was also another huge game changer for inspiring other players to focus more on their mental health as an NFL player. And the New Orleans Saints were caught with putting bounties on star NFL players for cash prizes. This is during the same season the Saints had won the Super Bowl. Closing off this video, we have the 2010s and the 2020s. And to start off the 2010s, we have Colin Kaepernick. Kaepernick famously took a knee during the national anthem. A lot of people thought his purpose was to disrespect the military, but the actual reason was to protest against police brutality. This sort of protest against police brutality was revived during the 2020 outrage on police brutality. Sports like basketball and baseball also started to kneel for the anthem. The NFL celebrated their 100th season in 2019. They had made the season more special by changing their branding, made an NFL 100 all-time team, and just an overall big year to celebrate the NFL's rich history. During the first quarter of a game, Bills player Damar Hamlin tackled wide receiver T. Higgins. After the play, Hamlin briefly stood up before collapsing on the field. He was unconscious, and when he was taken to the hospital minutes after the injury, both teams decided to cancel the game so they can focus on Damar's health. He would miraculously survive and would later on go back to play for his team. Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa suffered multiple concussions, with the most notable during a Bengals game where he displayed a fencing response after a sack. The incident highlighted concussion risks in the NFL. Despite calls to retire, including from Dr. Bennett Malu, Tua continues to play to this day. Before wrapping up, I want to share a list of events and names that didn't make it into this video, but were worth mentioning. Unfortunately, there's only so much I could fit into one video. As we saw, the NFL has experienced its share of highs and lows over the years, yet it continues to evolve. We've explored the struggles, the scandals, and the league's impact on the game. And with that, there you have it, the history of the NFL.